Good evening and thank you for being here once again. Tonight, we're setting off on a journey into the timeless legends of Greek mythology. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. So, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's get started. In the beginning, before Zeus claimed his throne of thunder and before the Titans fell into their chains of exile, there walked upon the earth children of darkness whose names have been whispered away by time itself. Their story begins not with the roar of battle or the clash of bronze upon bronze, but with silence, with shadow, and with the first tears ever shed by divine eyes. When Nyx, the primordial night, first stretched her star-woven cloak across the void, she did not walk alone. From her union with Erebus, the darkness that dwells beneath the earth, came forth beings both terrible and beautiful. The poets speak of some Thanatos, gentle death, and Hypnos, sweet sleep, who brings mercy to mortal suffering. But there were others, forgotten children whose power rivaled even the mighty Olympians, yet whose names were struck from the songs of men for reasons lost to the turning of ages. The first among these forgotten ones was Moros, whose name meant doom. He was not cruel as mortals understand cruelty, nor was he evil as men count evil. He simply was, as inevitable as the sunrise, as certain as the tide. Where Moros walked, fate crystallized into truth. Kings who thought themselves beyond the reach of consequence found their hubris rewarded with exile or death. Heroes who believed their strength could overcome destiny discovered that even divine blood could not wash away the stains of their choices. Moros appeared not as a skeletal figure draped in shadow, but as a young man of terrible beauty, his eyes holding the weight of every choice that would ever be made. His hair was dark as the space between stars, and when he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the finality of thunder's last echo. His skin bore the pallor of marble touched by moonlight, and his hands, when he extended them, seemed to draw the very light from the air around them. He moved through the world observing, never interfering, yet his very presence ensured that no deed, noble or base, would escape its rightful consequence. The mortals who glimpsed him in their final moments spoke of eyes that held no malice, no satisfaction in their doom, but rather a kind of cosmic sadness, as if he mourned every fate he was bound to witness. For Moros understood what no other being could comprehend, that doom was not a punishment but a completion, the final note that gave meaning to the entire song of existence. Beside him walked his sister, Ker, goddess of violent death. While Thanatos came gently to those whose time had ended, Ker haunted battlefields and places of strife. She was not the bringer of death, but rather its witness and its harvester. In her arms, she gathered the souls of those who died in fury, in pain, in the red moments when life spills forth like wine from a broken amphora. Her form shifted like smoke in wind, sometimes a maiden with blood-dark wings, sometimes a crone whose fingers were stained with the tears of mothers who had lost their sons. Unlike her brother, Ker felt the weight of every death she witnessed. Her immortal heart carried within it the echo of every final scream, every last prayer, every desperate plea for one more moment of life. She did not choose which souls to claim. That decision belonged to forces beyond even her comprehension. But she ensured that none died forgotten, that every violent end was witnessed by divine eyes and mourned by an immortal heart. In the earliest days of the world, when mortals first learned to fashion bronze into weapons and turn their strength against one another, Ker walked among the first battlefields with wonder and horror. She had not understood until that moment what it meant for creatures to choose their own destruction. The Titans fought with elemental force, their conflicts reshaping mountains and boiling seas, but they fought for dominion, for the right to rule the cosmos. Mortals, she discovered, could kill for reasons so small that even gods struggled to comprehend them, for insults, for pride, for pieces of land no larger than a temple's shadow. Yet in witnessing these deaths, Ker also witnessed something else: courage. She saw mortals face their doom with dignity, saw them die for causes greater than themselves, saw them choose honor over life and loyalty over safety. In time, she began to understand that violent death was not always a tragedy. Sometimes it was a kind of completion, the final act that defined a life's meaning. The third of the forgotten children was Apate, she who was deceit itself. Not the petty lies told by merchants in the agora or the sweet falsehoods whispered between lovers, but the great deceptions that shaped the course of nations and the fates of gods. Her beauty was a thing of mirrors and shadows, never quite the same when looked upon twice. To some, she appeared as their heart's greatest desire. To others, as their deepest fear made manifest. She spoke truths that sounded like lies and lies that rang with the clarity of truth, and those who listened to her found themselves walking paths they had never intended to tread. Apate understood that deception was not always cruelty. Sometimes mortals needed illusions to survive truths too terrible to bear. Sometimes they needed false hope to carry them through genuine despair. She wove dreams for the dying, painted visions of paradise for those who had lived in suffering, whispered promises of reunion to lovers separated by fate. Her deceptions could be merciful as often as they were cruel, and she alone among the gods understood that kindness and truth were not always the same thing. In the courts of early kings, Apate moved like a whisper in silk. She spoke to ambitious princes, showing them visions of crowns that would never rest upon their heads. She counseled desperate queens, offering strategies that would save their kingdoms through means they would never dare employ if they fully understood the cost. She planted seeds of necessary change in hearts that would otherwise have remained content with status quo, knowing that sometimes progress required deception about its true nature. These three Moros, Ker, and Apate were bound together not by choice but by necessity. For what is fate without the possibility of violent change? What is violent death without the deceptions that lead mortals to embrace it? And what are deceptions without the doom they ultimately bring? They moved through the early world like shadows cast by a fire that no mortal eyes could see, shaping the destiny of gods and men with their very presence. But they were not the only children born from the union of night and darkness. From that primordial coupling came others, each embodying forces that would shape the cosmos in ways both subtle and profound. There was Nemesis, she who was divine retribution itself, ensuring that no act of hubris went unpunished and no virtue went unrewarded. She appeared as a woman of stern beauty, her dark hair bound with silver bands, her eyes reflecting the perfect balance of the scales she carried. Upon her back were wings that could bear her across the world in moments, allowing her to witness every act of pride and every moment of humility. Nemesis understood that justice was not merely punishment for the wicked or reward for the virtuous. True justice was balance, the cosmic equilibrium that prevented any one force from dominating all others. She watched over mortals and immortals alike, ready to act when that balance was threatened. When a king grew too proud, she whispered to his enemies. When a hero began to believe his own legend, she arranged circumstances that would remind him of his mortality. When a people grew complacent in their prosperity, she ensured that challenges would arise to test their character. Yet Nemesis was not without compassion. She took no pleasure in the downfall of the proud, felt no satisfaction in the suffering of those who had overreached. Her interventions were motivated not by malice but by love for the cosmic order that allowed all things to flourish in their proper time and place. She was the guardian of the middle way, the divine force that prevented both tyranny and chaos. Beside Nemesis walked Eris, goddess of strife and discord, she who would one day cast a golden apple among the goddesses and thereby set in motion the events that would lead to the fall of Troy. But in those early days, Eris was not yet the agent of specific conflicts. She was rather the embodiment of change itself, the divine spark that prevented the universe from falling into eternal stagnation. Eris appeared as a woman of wild beauty, her hair streaming like flame, her eyes bright with the light of possibilities yet unrealized. Her laughter could shatter the silence of eternity, and her voice could plant questions in minds that had never before known doubt. She was not evil, though later ages would paint her as such, but rather necessary, the force that ensured growth, evolution, the constant renewal that kept existence from becoming mere repetition. In the courts of gods and the councils of mortals, Eris moved like a catalyst in a cosmic reaction. She asked uncomfortable questions, pointed out inconsistencies, suggested alternatives to established ways. She was the voice that whispered, "But what if things were different?" to minds that had grown comfortable with how things were. Without her influence, the Titans would have ruled forever in unchanging dominion. Mortals would never have dreamed of challenging the gods, and the great stories that defined the heroic ages would never have been born. Another among the forgotten children was Oasis, goddess of misery and woe, she who wept eternal tears for all the suffering that had ever been or ever would be. Her appearance was that of a woman wrapped in gray veils, her face hidden but her sorrow unmistakable. Where she walked, flowers wilted not from cruelty but from empathy, unable to bear the weight of the grief she carried. Yet her gift, dark though it seemed, was not without purpose. For it was through suffering that mortals learned compassion, through loss that they understood the value of what remained, through sorrow that they discovered the true depth of joy. Oasis did not cause suffering. That was not her nature. Rather, she was present wherever suffering existed, ensuring that no pain went unwitnessed, no grief went unmourned. In her tears was contained the essence of every sorrow that had ever been shed, and in her presence, even the most isolated mourner could feel that their pain was shared, that they wept not alone but in communion with the divine. During the age of Kronos, when that Titan king ruled with iron certainty and consumed his children to prevent his prophesied downfall, Oasis walked among mortals with particular frequency. She saw how the tyranny of the sky affected those below, how fear of change created its own forms of suffering. She wept for the children who would never know their father's love, for the queen who lost each newborn to her husband's paranoia, for the world itself that was denied the growth that comes only through generational change. Yet another of the forgotten children was Phylides, goddess of affection and friendship, she who represented the bonds that connected all living things. Unlike Aphrodite, whose domain was passionate love, Phylides governed the gentler connections, the loyalty between comrades, the warmth between neighbors, the quiet affection that builds slowly over time and endures even when passion fades. Phylides appeared as a woman of middle years, neither young nor old, her face bearing the kind of beauty that comes from kindness rather than physical perfection. Her touch could soothe anger, her presence could bridge the gap between enemies, her voice could remind even the most isolated soul that they were not alone in the cosmos. She moved through the world like a gentle breeze, bringing comfort to the lonely, courage to the afraid, and hope to the despairing. In the early days of mortal civilization, when humans first began to gather in communities larger than family groups, Phylides worked tirelessly to weave the bonds that would hold these new societies together. She whispered to suspicious neighbors, reminding them of shared interests. She guided lonely souls toward companionship, helped the shy find their voices, and showed the proud the value of humility in friendship. There was also Geras, he who embodied old age and the wisdom that comes with the passage of time. Unlike mortals, who feared aging as decay and loss, Geras understood old age as accumulation, the gathering of experience, knowledge, understanding. He appeared as an elderly man whose every wrinkle told a story, whose eyes held the depth that comes only from having seen seasons turn through countless cycles. Geras moved slowly through the world, not from infirmity but from the deliberate pace of one who had learned the value of patience. He watched civilizations rise and fall, saw the same mistakes repeated across generations, witnessed the slow evolution of wisdom through the accumulated learning of ages. In his presence, even the youngest souls could feel the weight of history, the continuity that connected every moment to all that had come before. During the reign of Kronos, these forgotten children moved through the world like threads in a vast tapestry, each contributing their essential element to the pattern of existence. They witnessed the Titan King's growing paranoia, saw how his fear of change created the very conditions that would ensure his downfall. They understood, as Kronos did not, that the attempt to prevent fate often becomes the very mechanism by which fate is fulfilled. It was in the time when Kronos still ruled the cosmos with iron certainty that the forgotten children first made their power known to the divine realm. The Titan King, despite his terrible cunning, had not foreseen their existence. His prophets spoke of threats that might come, but they spoke only of things that could be seen, touched, measured. They did not speak of abstractions made flesh, of concepts given divine form and will. The first sign came when Moros appeared in the court of Kronos, unbidden and unexpected. The guards who stood eternal watch at the gates of the Titan Palace did not challenge him, for they could not see him. Only those whose fate was already written in the stars could perceive his presence. The great bronze doors, which had been forged by the Cyclopes in the early days of creation, and which had never opened without Kronos's direct command, swung silently wide to admit him. As Moros walked through the corridors of the Titan Palace, reality itself seemed to shift subtly around him. Tapestries depicting Kronos's victories began to fray at the edges. Golden vessels, which had never known tarnish, began to show signs of age. The very marble of the walls, quarried from the bones of mountains and shaped by divine hands, developed hairline cracks that spread like spider webs through the stone. Kronos, who had devoured his children to prevent his own overthrow, felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter wind when Moros stepped into the great hall where the Titan king held court with his brothers and sisters. The assembled Titans, Oceanus the river girdler, Hyperion lord of light, Ceus the inquirer, Crius the constellation bearer, Iapetus ancestor of men, all felt the change in the air, though none could name its source. Moros spoke no words of prophecy, made no gestures of threat. He simply stood, beautiful and silent, at the center of the great hall, and Kronos understood with the clarity of absolute terror that his doom had already been decided. Not by oracle or seer, not by the plotting of his enemies, but by forces far older and more fundamental than even the ancient Titans. For the first time since he had claimed the throne of heaven by castrating his father Uranus, Kronos knew the taste of helplessness. The Titan king's hands, which had never trembled even when wielding the great sickle against his father, began to shake. His voice, which had commanded the very elements to obedience, caught in his throat. Around him, his siblings felt the shift in cosmic balance, sensed that something fundamental had changed in the order of things, though they could not perceive its source. Yet Moros did not strike. He had not come to end Kronos, but merely to witness the moment when the Titan king truly understood that his fall was not a possibility but a certainty. Having delivered this silent message, having planted the seed of inevitability in the heart of tyranny itself, Moros turned and walked from the hall. His departure was as silent as his arrival, but the cracks he had introduced into the foundation of Kronos' certainty continued to spread like fault lines through stone. In the days that followed, strange reports reached the court of Kronos. Messengers spoke of unsettling omens, of signs that suggested change was stirring in the deep places of the world. Cattle were found dead in fields without any mark of violence upon them, simply expired as if they had suddenly remembered their mortality. Springs that had flowed pure for millennia began to run muddy. Stars that had held their positions since the ordering of the heavens began to drift from their appointed places. Ker had been seen walking through the mortal realm, her dark wings spread over battlefields where no wars were being fought. Yet where she passed, old grievances stirred to new life. Soldiers would wake from peaceful sleep with the memory of violence in their hearts, and brothers who had lived in harmony for years would suddenly find cause to draw swords against one another. She was not creating conflict, the wise among the Titans whispered, but rather preparing the ground for conflicts that must come to pass. Meanwhile, Apate moved through the world like a whisper in the wind, her presence felt but never quite seen. She spoke to the ambitious and the desperate, to the proud and the fearful. Her words were like seeds planted in fertile darkness. They grew slowly, sending out roots that wrapped around the hearts of those who heard them. A minor god might hear her voice and begin to dream of greater power. A Titan might listen to her counsel and begin to question the loyalty of his siblings. She wove webs of suspicion and desire that would one day entangle all of Olympus in their strands. To a river nymph who had caught the eye of Zeus in his youth, Apate whispered of the power that might come from divine favor. To a shepherd king who ruled a small mountain realm, she spoke of destiny and greatness waiting to be claimed. To Rhea herself, the queen of the Titans and mother of devoured children, she murmured of hope hidden in distant places, of possibilities that even the all-seeing Kronos might fail to perceive. Yet these three forgotten children were not alone in their work. From the depths of primordial night came others, equally powerful, equally ignored by the songs of later ages. Nemesis walked among the courts of gods and men, her silver-bound scales weighing every act of pride and humility. She saw how Kronos' absolute power had begun to corrupt even his virtues, how the fear that had driven him to devour his children was transforming him from a just king into a paranoid tyrant. In the mortal realm, Nemesis observed the growing inequality between ruler and ruled. Under Kronos' iron dominion, the natural cycle of generational change had been suspended. The young never inherited from the old, the new never replaced the established, and without this constant renewal, both divine and mortal societies had begun to stagnate. She began to plant the seeds of correction, whispering to hearts that yearned for change, strengthening the resolve of those who dared to dream of better times. She did not openly rebel against Kronos, such direct action was not her way, but she ensured that the cosmic imbalance he had created would eventually correct itself through the working of natural law. Eris, meanwhile, delighted in the growing tensions that rippled through both Olympus and the mortal world. She saw opportunity in every moment of discord, potential in every conflict. Like an artist working with the raw materials of chaos, she began to shape the disagreements and suspicions that would eventually tear apart the Titan order. In the divine realm, she whispered questions that had never been asked before. Why should Kronos rule simply because he had overthrown his father? What gave him the right to determine the fate of his children? Was strength alone sufficient justification for power? These questions, once planted, grew like weeds in the garden of absolute authority. In the mortal world, she encouraged the first philosophers, those who dared to ask whether the current order was truly the best possible arrangement. She inspired the first rebels, those who questioned whether divine rule by right of conquest was truly just. She nurtured the first dreamers of democracy, equality, and justice based on merit rather than birth. Oasis, the weeping goddess, walked among mortals with increasing frequency as Kronos' reign extended beyond its natural term. She wept for the children who would never know their fathers, for the mothers whose hopes were eternally deferred, for the world itself which had been denied the renewal that comes only through change. Her tears fell like rain upon the earth, and where they touched the soil, flowers grew that bloomed in shades of gray and silver, beautiful but melancholy, perfect symbols of hope deferred but not destroyed. Yet it was not only sorrow that Oasis brought to the world. In her tears was contained the memory of every joy that had been lost, every happiness that had been sacrificed to fear. Those who looked into her veiled face could see reflected there not only what they had lost, but what they might yet gain if they found the courage to reach for it. Phylides worked tirelessly to maintain the bonds of affection that held the world together even as cosmic forces pressed toward dissolution. She saw how Kronos' paranoia was isolating him from those who had once been his closest allies, how fear was eroding the trust that had once made the Titan court a place of counsel and wisdom rather than suspicion and terror. Among mortals, she strengthened friendships that transcended tribal boundaries, fostered alliances between peoples who might otherwise have remained enemies, and nurtured the growth of communities based on mutual aid rather than domination. She understood that the coming changes would require unprecedented cooperation among those who had been strangers, and she worked to build the foundations of trust upon which future unity might be based. Geras moved through the world with the measured pace of accumulated wisdom, watching as the artificial prolonging of Kronos' reign created distortions in the natural order of time itself. Seasons began to blur into one another, with spring failing to follow winter and harvest time arriving without warning. The careful cycles that governed both divine and mortal life were disrupted by the Titan King's refusal to accept the natural progression of ages. In quiet conversations with mortals and immortals alike, Geras spoke of the beauty of natural endings, of the way completion gave meaning to everything that came before. He reminded those who would listen that wisdom came not from avoiding change but from understanding how to navigate it gracefully. As these influences accumulated and intertwined, as the forgotten children continued their quiet work of preparing the world for transformation, the stage was set for the events that would reshape the cosmos. In a cave on the island of Crete, a child was growing to manhood. Zeus, hidden from his father's sight by his mother's desperate stratagem. He was being raised by nymphs and shepherds, learning lessons of humility and compassion that no Titan prince had ever been taught. The forgotten children watched his progress with interest, for they could perceive in him qualities that set him apart from his predecessors. Where Kronos ruled through fear, Zeus would learn to rule through inspiration. Where the Titan King had isolated himself in suspicion, the young god was learning the value of alliance and friendship. Where Kronos saw every challenge as a threat to be crushed, Zeus was developing the wisdom to distinguish between enemies who must be defeated and opposition that might be transformed into strength. When Zeus finally emerged from his hidden sanctuary and began to gather allies for the war that would determine the fate of the cosmos, the forgotten children were there to guide his steps. Moros ensured that every decision the young god made would serve the greater pattern of destiny. Ker prepared the way for the violent changes that must come, gathering her strength to witness and sanctify the necessary deaths. Apate whispered the strategic deceptions that would turn Titan against Titan and ensure that the old order could never reconstitute itself. Nemesis weighed each of Zeus's actions against the cosmic scales, ensuring that his rebellion was truly just rather than merely ambitious. Eris delighted in the growing discord that split the Titan ranks, encouraging the conflicts that would weaken Kronos' support. Oasis wept for the suffering that war would bring, but also for the suffering that would be ended when tyranny finally fell. Phylides worked to strengthen the bonds between Zeus and his allies, ensuring that their coalition was built on genuine trust rather than mere convenience. Geras counseled patience when the young god's enthusiasm threatened to overwhelm his judgment, reminding him that lasting victory required not just strength but wisdom. The Titanomachy, when it finally erupted, lasted 10 years by mortal reckoning. The earth shook with the force of divine combat. Mountains were hurled like stones, and the very fabric of existence strained under the pressure of such titanic conflict. Oceans boiled, the sky rained fire, and reality itself seemed to buckle under the weight of cosmic warfare. Yet to the forgotten children, who perceived time differently than mortals or even Olympians, the outcome had never been in doubt. They had seen it written in the threads of possibility, had felt its inevitability in the growing imbalance that Kronos' tyranny had created. The war was not so much a battle as a correction, the universe's way of restoring the natural order that had been suspended for too long. During those 10 years of conflict, the forgotten children played roles that were subtle but crucial. Moros walked among the battling titans, his presence ensuring that each death and defeat served the greater pattern of necessary change. Those who glimpsed him in the chaos of battle reported that he appeared sad but resolute, like a physician who must perform a painful operation to save a patient's life. Kerr moved across the battlefields with unprecedented purpose, for never before had she been called upon to witness the deaths of immortal beings. The Titans and their allies who fell in battle did not simply cease to exist. They were transformed, their divine essence recycled into new forms, their power redistributed according to laws older than consciousness itself. Kerr ensured that these transformations occurred with dignity, that even in defeat the ancient powers retained their fundamental honor. Apate wove deceptions that served strategic necessity while avoiding unnecessary cruelty. She might cause a Titan general to believe that reinforcements were coming when in fact his position was hopeless, allowing him to maintain hope and fight with honor rather than despair. She might convince a wavering ally of Kronos that Zeus had already achieved certain victories, encouraging defection that would shorten the war and reduce overall suffering. Yet even as the war raged and the forgotten children played their parts in its unfolding, a smaller drama was taking place that would prove equally significant in shaping the future of the cosmos. It was the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, whose love would test the very boundaries between life and death, between hope and despair, between the possible and the inevitable. Orpheus was born during the early years of the Titanomachy, his birth a sign that even in times of cosmic warfare, beauty and art could still come into existence. His father was either Eurydice, a river god, or Apollo himself. The stories differed, but all agreed that divine music flowed in his veins. His mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and from her he inherited not just musical talent, but the deeper gift of understanding how individual stories fit into the greater narrative of existence. From his earliest years, Orpheus displayed an affinity for music that surpassed even divine standards. When he sang, wild beasts grew tame, trees uprooted themselves to follow him, and even stones rolled downhill to hear his voice. His lyre, a gift from Hermes and blessed by Apollo, could produce harmonies that reflected the underlying music of the spheres, the cosmic song that kept reality itself in tune. The forgotten children took notice of Orpheus from the beginning, for they recognized in him someone who might bridge the gap between mortal experience and divine truth. His music had the power to make abstract concepts tangible, to give emotional weight to philosophical principles. When he sang of love, listeners felt their hearts expand with understanding. When he sang of loss, even the immortal gods found themselves moved to tears. As Orpheus grew to manhood, his reputation spread across the Mediterranean world. Kings invited him to their courts, knowing that his presence would bring peace and harmony to their realms. Warriors laid down their arms when he played, remembering the loves they had left behind and the homes they fought to protect. Even the gods of Olympus, busy with their great war against the Titans, paused to listen when Orpheus lifted his voice in song. It was during this time that Orpheus met Eurydice, a nymph whose beauty was matched only by her gentle spirit. The forgotten children, who perceived the threads of fate that connected all beings, could see that their love was one of those rare perfect matches, two souls so complementary that their union created something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Their courtship was like a song made manifest, each moment a perfect note in an evolving melody. They walked together through meadows where flowers bloomed more brightly in response to their happiness. They sat beside streams that altered their courses to provide better acoustics for Orpheus's serenades. They lay beneath stars that seemed to shine with greater intensity when illuminated by the light of their love. When they married, the ceremony was attended by gods and mortals alike, for their union was recognized as something that transcended ordinary human experience. Even in the midst of the Titanomachy, Zeus himself paused to bless their marriage, understanding that love like theirs was one of the forces that made all the cosmic struggles worthwhile. The forgotten children watched the wedding with particular interest, for they could perceive currents of possibility that surrounded the young couple. Moros saw multiple potential futures branching out from this single moment, some bright with continued happiness, others dark with tragedy. Kerr felt the presence of violent death hovering like a shadow at the edge of perception, though its precise form remained unclear. Apate sensed that great deceptions would grow from this union, though whether they would be merciful or cruel remained to be determined. Yet even as they perceived these shadows of possibility, the forgotten children did not intervene. Their nature was to witness and to ensure cosmic balance, not to prevent individual tragedies that served larger purposes. They understood, as Orpheus and Eurydice did not, that perfect happiness in an imperfect world must inevitably encounter testing. For a time that seemed eternal but was measured in mere months, the couple lived in bliss that approached the divine. Their love became legendary, inspiring poets and lovers across the known world. Orpheus composed songs that captured not just the joy of their union but its deeper meaning, the way love could transform two separate beings into a single entity while somehow enhancing rather than diminishing their individual natures. But the forgotten children knew, as they always knew, that such perfect happiness could not last indefinitely in a cosmos governed by the necessity of change. The instrument of transformation came in the form of Aristeus, a minor god who ruled over cattle and the art of beekeeping, whose desires were as relentless as his nature was selfish. Aristeus had encountered Eurydice by chance during one of her solitary walks through the meadows near the home she shared with Orpheus. Her beauty struck him like a physical blow, awakening in him a hunger that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with possession. He began to court her with increasing insistence, deaf to her gentle refusals, blind to her obvious contentment with her marriage. The forgotten children observed his growing obsession with the detachment that came from understanding larger patterns. Apate recognized the self-deception that allowed Aristeus to believe his desires justified any action he might take. Moros perceived the threads of fate that were drawing tighter around all the participants in this developing drama. Kerr felt violent death approaching like a storm front, inexorable and destructive. On the day that would transform joy into tragedy, Aristeus cornered Eurydice in a meadow far from the village where she and Orpheus made their home. His pursuit was no longer a matter of courtship but of attempted conquest, his intentions clear in every gesture and word. Eurydice, who had never known fear or violence, ran with the desperation of innocence encountering evil for the first time. As she fled through grass made treacherous by morning dew, her attention focused entirely on escape, she failed to notice the serpent that lay coiled in her path. The creature, startled by her approach, struck with instinctive speed. Its fangs pierced her heel, injecting venom that no mortal frame could survive, no matter how beloved by gods and men. The serpent itself was no ordinary creature, but one of the primordial offspring of Echidna, the mother of monsters, whose venom carried within it the essence of inevitable ending. There was no malice in its strike, it acted purely from instinct, the same instinct that had preserved its kind since the earliest days of creation. Yet that simple, natural response became the catalyst for events that would shake the very foundations of divine order. Eurydice felt the poison spreading through her veins like liquid ice, numbing her limbs and clouding her vision. She collapsed to the earth that had always welcomed her steps, her hands grasping at grass that would never again bend beneath her weight. Her final moments were not filled with anger toward her pursuer or fear of what lay beyond death, but with sorrow for the love she was leaving incomplete, the songs that would never be finished, the future that would never unfold. Her last words, whispered so softly that only the wind could hear them, were a message for Orpheus, not a farewell, for she could not accept that their separation would be permanent, but a promise that love like theirs could not be truly ended by something as temporary as death. When Orpheus discovered her body, still warm but already empty of the spark that had made it more than mere flesh, his grief transcended mortal experience and approached the divine. The forgotten children, who had witnessed every form of sorrow that had ever existed, found themselves awed by the depth and purity of his anguish. Here was grief so profound that it threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Orpheus did not rage against the gods or curse the fate that had stolen his happiness. Instead, he took up his lyre and began to sing. His music on that dark day was unlike anything he had ever created before. It was sorrow made audible, grief given perfect form, love transformed by loss into something that transcended both joy and pain. The song he sang was wordless, for no language could contain what he felt. Yet every creature that heard it understood its meaning with perfect clarity. Trees that had stood for centuries bent their branches in mourning. Rivers altered their courses to flow past the place where Eurydice had died, their waters carrying his lament to distant seas. Birds fell silent, unable to compete with music that expressed what they had never found words to convey. The forgotten children gathered to listen, drawn by harmonies that spoke directly to their essential natures. In Orpheus's song, Moros heard the sound of fate accepting its own limitations. Kerr perceived the echo of every violent death that had ever been mourned by love. Apate recognized truth so pure that no deception could survive in its presence. But Orpheus did not sing merely to express his pain. He sang with purpose, with a determination that impressed even the forgotten children who watched from shadows. For he had conceived of a plan so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would test the very foundations of the divine order. He would descend into the underworld itself and demand the return of his wife. The journey to the gates of Hades was long and treacherous, leading through regions of the world that existed at the boundary between life and death. Orpheus walked paths that few mortals had ever seen, through valleys where no sun shone and across rivers that reflected no light. The very air grew thinner as he approached the realm of the dead, charged with energies that mortal lungs were never meant to breathe. Yet his lyre sustained him, its music creating pockets of harmony in the chaotic wilderness that bordered the realm of the dead. Where his songs touched the twisted landscape, flowers bloomed briefly before withering, as if the land itself were trying to remember what beauty felt like. Strange creatures that had never known names watched him pass, their alien forms somehow softened by melodies that spoke of universal truths. The forgotten children accompanied him on this journey, though he could not perceive their presence. Moros walked beside him, ensuring that each step served the greater pattern of destiny unfolding. Kerr hovered near, her wings casting shadows that protected him from the more dangerous emanations of the borderlands. Apate whispered guidance that reached him not as words but as intuitive understanding of which paths to take and which to avoid. When Orpheus reached the banks of the river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, he found Charon the ferryman waiting with an expression of grim curiosity. The ancient boatman had ferried countless souls across these dark waters, but never before had a living person approached his vessel with such clear purpose. Charon's boat was a thing of terrible beauty, carved from wood that had grown in forests that existed before the sun was born. Its hull was stained black by the waters of the Styx, and along its sides were carved reliefs depicting every form of death that had ever claimed a mortal soul. The ferryman himself appeared as an elderly man of imposing stature, his beard white as bone, his eyes holding depths that reflected the accumulated sorrow of ages. When Orpheus began to play, asking passage not with coins but with music, Charon found himself weeping tears he had not shed since the birth of the world. The song spoke to something in the ferryman's heart that he had thought lost forever, the memory of what it meant to hope, to love, to believe that endings might sometimes be transformed into new beginnings. Without a word, Charon gestured for the living man to board his vessel. As they crossed the black waters of the Styx, the boat moved not with the labored strokes of oars but with the rhythm of Orpheus's music, each note propelling them forward through currents that had never known such harmony. The forgotten children watched this crossing with fascination, for they understood its symbolic significance. Here was a mortal so committed to love that he was willing to enter the realm where love was thought impossible, to challenge the fundamental separation between life and death through the power of perfect art. On the far shore waited Cerberus, the three-headed hound whose very presence was enough to paralyze mortals with terror. Each of the beast's heads was larger than a bull, its teeth like bronze spears, its eyes burning with fires that had been kindled in the early days of creation. The creature's growl could shatter stone, and its breath carried the essence of every nightmare that had ever haunted mortal sleep. Yet when Orpheus began to play, something unprecedented occurred. The three heads of Cerberus, which had never agreed on anything, found themselves moving in perfect synchronization, swaying gently to rhythms that spoke of companionship rather than threat. The beast's eyes, which had burned with eternal vigilance, grew soft with something that might have been contentment. For the first time since its birth, Cerberus lay down, all three heads resting peacefully on enormous paws. The hound that had been born to guard the gates of death had been transformed, however briefly, into something resembling a beloved pet drowsing in afternoon sunshine. And so Orpheus entered the underworld, the first and only living soul to do so by the power of art rather than divine intervention or trickery. As he walked through the gray fields where the dead wandered in eternal twilight, his music preceded him like light piercing darkness. The underworld that Orpheus encountered was not the place of torment that later traditions would describe, but rather a realm of profound sadness, where souls existed in a state of diminished being, their mortal experiences fading like half-remembered dreams. The shades of the deceased, normally silent and withdrawn, began to follow him, drawn by melodies that reminded them of the joys they had known in life. Among these following spirits were the great heroes of ages past, their forms now translucent but still recognizable. Achilles walked behind Orpheus, his immortal rage transformed into wistful longing. Hector followed, the noble defender of Troy who had died with honor but still mourned the family he had been forced to leave behind. Ajax the Greater strode among them, his pride now tempered by the wisdom that comes only after death. But it was not only heroes who were stirred by Orpheus's music. Common souls, farmers and merchants, mothers and children, craftsmen and slaves, found themselves drawn from their gray wanderings by songs that awakened memories of love, hope, and the simple pleasures that had made their mortal lives worth living. The forgotten children observed this unprecedented gathering with something approaching awe. They had witnessed every form of divine intervention in mortal affairs, but never before had they seen the dead respond to the living with such unanimous recognition. Here was proof that art, when perfected by love, could bridge even the ultimate separation. As Orpheus progressed deeper into the underworld, the landscape around him began to change. The gray fields gave way to more defined regions, each reflecting different aspects of death and afterlife. He passed through the asphodel meadows, where souls of ordinary virtue spent their eternal rest, and saw how his music brought color to flowers that had bloomed only in shades of gray since the creation of the underworld. He walked through regions where various punishments were carried out, witnessing the eternal torments of those who had committed great crimes in life. Even here, his music brought momentary relief. Tantalus, reaching forever for fruit and water that receded at his touch, found that Orpheus's melodies made his phantom nourishment briefly real. Sisyphus, condemned to roll his stone up a mountain for eternity, discovered that the rhythm of the songs made his burden somehow lighter. The Danaids, forced to carry water in vessels with holes in their bottoms, found that while Orpheus played, their jars remained miraculously full. Even the Furies, those ancient goddesses of vengeance whose anger had burned since the first murder was committed, felt their eternal rage soften into something resembling mercy. The forgotten children recognized in these transformations something that challenged their understanding of cosmic law. They had always known that certain principles were absolute: death was final, punishment was eternal, the past could not be changed. Yet here was a mortal whose love was so pure, whose art was so perfect, that it was causing the very foundations of the underworld to shift. Moros found himself questioning for the first time whether doom was truly inevitable. If music could make the damned forget their torments, if love could bring color to the gray fields of death, then perhaps fate itself was not as fixed as he had always believed. Kerr watched the faces of the dead as they listened to Orpheus's songs, and saw in their expressions something she had never encountered in all her ages of harvesting souls' hope. Not the false hope of denial or delusion, but genuine hope based on the evidence of their senses that impossible things might sometimes become possible. Apate observed the way Orpheus's truth cut through every deception, every comfortable lie that allowed the underworld to function according to its established rules. His music was so honest, so completely without pretense, that it made even the necessary illusions of the afterlife seem suddenly transparent and fragile. At the heart of the underworld stood the Palace of Hades, a structure that defied mortal comprehension. Its walls were built from compressed darkness, solid shadow that had been shaped by divine will into architectural form. Its towers rose beyond sight, disappearing into caverns that stretched infinitely upward. Its halls echoed with the whispers of every secret that mortals had carried to their graves. As Orpheus approached this palace, the very stones began to resonate with his music, creating harmonies that had never existed before in the realm of the dead. Windows that had never known light began to glow softly. Doors that had remained closed since the ordering of the cosmos creaked open, as if welcoming an honored guest. The forgotten children recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in cosmic history. The underworld, which had been designed as the antithesis of life, was responding to Orpheus as if it were a living thing capable of joy and hope and transformation. When Orpheus finally stood before the throne of Hades, the lord of the underworld did not speak immediately. He sat in silence, his dark eyes fixed upon the mortal who had achieved the impossible simply by refusing to accept that love could be defeated by death. The throne upon which he sat was carved from a single massive obsidian, its surface reflecting not light but the souls of all who had ever died. Beside him sat Persephone, queen of the underworld, whose own story was one of forced separation and reluctant acceptance. She had been taken from the world of light and life, had learned to find meaning in darkness and death. In Orpheus, she saw something of her former self, someone who refused to accept that loss must be permanent, that love could be conquered by circumstance. The throne room itself was vast beyond mortal measurement, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls lined with crystalline formations that had grown from the compressed tears of the dead. At its center burned a fire that gave no light but somehow illuminated everything, revealing truths that daylight could never expose. Orpheus raised his lyre and began to play. The song that emerged was his masterpiece, a composition that contained within its notes everything he had learned about love, loss, beauty, and the desperate courage of those who refuse to surrender hope even in the face of absolute despair. He sang of Eurydice, not as she had been in life, but as she existed in the perfection of memory, every moment of joy they had shared, every word of love they had exchanged, every dream they had built together for a future that had been stolen from them. His music painted pictures more vivid than any artist's brush could create, evoking the scent of flowers in her hair, the sound of her laughter, the way sunlight had seemed brighter in her presence. But he also sang of what her absence had done to the world. He told of flowers that no longer bloomed as brightly, of birds whose songs had grown melancholy, of a universe that had become subtly but fundamentally less beautiful with her passing. His music made it clear that Eurydice's death had not simply ended one life, but had diminished all life, had torn a hole in the fabric of existence that could only be mended by her return. As the music filled the throne room, changes began to manifest throughout the underworld that defied every natural law. The river Lethe, whose waters brought forgetfulness to the dead, began to run backward, carrying memories upstream toward their sources. The chains that bound the Titans in Tartarus grew slack, not from any failure of their construction, but from a loosening of the cosmic certainties that had forged them. The very architecture of death began to shift and change. Walls of solid shadow became translucent. Floors of compressed despair began to show cracks through which something resembling hope leaked upward. The eternal fires that marked the boundaries of various punishments flickered and dimmed, as if their fuel of endless suffering had been somehow compromised. But it was upon the forgotten children that the music had its most profound effect. They, who had never known what it meant to hope for change, suddenly found themselves touched by something they had never expected to feel: the desire for happiness to triumph over sorrow, for love to prove stronger than fate itself. Moros, who had always seen only the ending of stories, began for the first time to wonder if endings might be transformed into beginnings. The doom that he embodied and witnessed seemed suddenly less like inevitable fate and more like one possibility among many, subject to change through the application of sufficient love and will. Kerr, who had harvested only the violent dead throughout her eternal existence, felt a longing she had never known before, the desire to gather souls not in death but in reunion, not in ending but in restoration. She began to imagine what it would mean to be present not at the moment of violent separation but at the moment of joyful return. Apate, whose very nature was deception, found herself wishing that the truth of love could be the only reality. For the first time in her existence, she encountered something so genuine, so completely honest, that it made her own powers seem not just unnecessary but actively harmful to the working of cosmic justice. Nemesis felt the scales of justice trembling as she weighed Orpheus's request against the cosmic law that separated life from death. For the first time in her eternal existence, she found herself uncertain about where true balance lay: in maintaining the established order or in allowing love to triumph over law. Eris discovered that her nature as the goddess of discord was being challenged by music that created only harmony. Yet rather than feeling threatened, she found herself wondering if the change that she represented might sometimes take the form not of conflict but of miraculous transformation. Oasis, who wept eternal tears for all suffering, found her sorrow mixed with something she had never experienced before: joy. Not the joy that comes from the absence of pain, but the deeper joy that comes from witnessing love so pure that it transforms even the nature of sorrow itself. Pylades felt the bonds of affection that she governed stretching across the boundary between life and death, proving that connection could survive even the ultimate separation. In Orpheus's love for Eurydice, she saw the prototype of every friendship, every familial bond, every form of caring that gave meaning to existence. Geras, the embodiment of age and wisdom, recognized in Orpheus's music the kind of understanding that usually came only through long experience of loss and recovery. Here was a young man who had learned through love what normally required centuries of living: that endings were not failures but transitions, that loss was not defeat but transformation. When Orpheus's song finally ended, the silence that followed was unlike any that had ever existed in the underworld. It was not the silence of death or ending, but the silence of possibility, of a universe holding its breath to see what would happen next. The forgotten children waited, understanding that they were present at a moment that would reshape their own understanding of cosmic law. They had always believed that certain principles were absolute, that the boundaries between life and death, joy and sorrow, hope and despair were fixed and unalterable. Yet they had just witnessed those boundaries become permeable under the influence of perfect love expressed through perfect art. Hades spoke at last, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority tempered by something that had never been there before: uncertainty. The Lord of the Dead, who had never doubted the rightness of his realm's laws, found himself questioning whether those laws might sometimes conflict with higher principles. His words echoed through the throne room and beyond, reaching every corner of the underworld where souls waited to learn whether the impossible might become possible. He declared that Orpheus had accomplished something unprecedented, something that challenged the very foundations upon which the realm of the dead had been built. Through the power of his music, through the purity of his love, Orpheus had demonstrated that mortal emotions could achieve a kind of perfection that rivaled divine power. He had shown that art, when motivated by genuine love rather than mere ambition or ego, could bridge any separation, overcome any obstacle, transform any reality. As a recognition of this achievement, as an acknowledgement that some forms of love transcended even the ultimate boundary between existence and non-existence, Eurydice would be permitted to return to the world of the living. But there was a condition, one that reflected the delicate balance that must be maintained even when allowing miracles to occur. The condition was both simple and cruel in its simplicity. Orpheus would be allowed to lead his wife from the underworld, but he must not look back at her until they both stood once again beneath the sun. Should he turn around even once during their ascent, should he attempt to confirm through sight what he was asked to accept through faith, she would be lost to him forever, this time with no possibility of return. The forgotten children understood the necessity of this condition even as they felt its cruelty. The test was not arbitrary but essential. It measured not just Orpheus's faith in divine promises but his acceptance that some goods could only be possessed by those willing to risk losing them entirely. Moros saw in the condition the working of his own essential nature, the understanding that even miracles came with a price, that even the gods could not simply overturn cosmic law without consequence. The test would determine whether Orpheus had truly learned to accept the reality of fate or whether he still believed that will and desire alone could reshape the universe. Kerr recognized that the condition created the possibility of an even more tragic ending than the original loss. If Orpheus failed the test, Eurydice's second death would be not accidental but the direct result of his own action, a burden that might destroy him more completely than mere grief. Apate perceived the layers of deception built into the situation. The way hope itself might become a form of torment, the way trust might be transformed into the very mechanism of betrayal. The condition would test not just faith but the ability to distinguish between different kinds of truth. Orpheus accepted the terms without hesitation. For what choice did he have? To refuse would mean leaving Eurydice in the realm of the dead forever, while to accept offered at least the possibility of restoration. The man who had descended into death itself for love was not about to be deterred by a test of faith, no matter how cruel its design. He turned his back on the throne of Hades and began the long journey toward the surface, trusting in sounds too subtle for mortal ears to confirm that his wife was following behind him. Each step was an act of faith, each moment of continued forward movement a choice to believe in promises rather than demand proof. The ascent was a torment unlike anything Orpheus had ever experienced. Behind him, he could hear what he believed to be Eurydice's footsteps, could sense what felt like her presence. The air stirred occasionally as if disturbed by another's passing. Sometimes he caught the faintest hint of the perfume she had favored in life. These signs sustained him, yet they also tormented him, for they were too subtle to provide certainty, too ambiguous to silence doubt. As they climbed through the various regions of the underworld, past the places of punishment and fields of neutrality, past the rivers and gates that marked the boundaries between different states of death, Orpheus found his mind besieged by questions that grew more insistent with each step. Was she truly there, or were the sounds he heard merely echoes of his own desperate hope? Had Hades kept his word, Or was this an elaborate test designed to demonstrate the futility of challenging divine law? Was love enough to overcome death? Or had he simply been granted a cruel illusion that would make his ultimate failure even more painful? The forgotten children followed the pair as they climbed toward the light, and for the first time in their eternal existence, they found themselves genuinely uncertain about the outcome of events they were witnessing. Moros, who could usually perceive the shape of fate with perfect clarity, found his vision clouded by contradictory possibilities. The future branched and rebranched around this single moment of choice, creating patterns too complex for even his cosmic perception to untangle. Kerr found herself actually hoping, for the success of a mortal endeavor, a sensation so foreign to her nature that it left her feeling disoriented and strange. She who had always accepted violent death as inevitable now discovered that she wanted desperately for this one story to end differently. Apate observed the way that truth and deception had become intertwined in the test itself. Orpheus was being asked to act on faith that felt like truth while ignoring evidence that felt like deception. The ultimate honesty was requiring the acceptance of what appeared to be the ultimate lie. As they approached the boundary between the underworld and the realm of the living, as the first faint traces of natural light began to penetrate the eternal darkness of the realm of the dead, Orpheus felt his doubts reach their crescendo. The silence behind him seemed to mock his faith. The absence of any solid confirmation of Eurydice's presence began to feel less like a test of trust and more like evidence of deception. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, unable to take another step without some confirmation that his suffering had meaning, that his journey had not been in vain, Orpheus made the choice that would define the rest of his existence. He turned around. Eurydice was there. For one perfect, eternal moment, she was absolutely, undeniably there. More beautiful than ever, her face radiant with joy at their approaching reunion, her eyes bright with love and gratitude and the promise of the life they would rebuild together. She reached out her hand toward his, and in her smile was contained all the happiness they had ever shared and all the happiness they might yet know. But even as she smiled, even as she spoke his name in a voice filled with love and forgiveness and understanding, her form began to fade. The light that had illuminated her features grew dim. Her solid flesh became translucent, and her voice, calling his name not in reproach but in eternal love, grew distant as a whisper carried away by wind. She was gone, drawn back into the underworld by forces more powerful than any mortal will, more final than any divine promise. And this time, as Hades had warned, there would be no second chance, no possibility of appeal or return. Death had claimed its due, and not even the most perfect music could challenge its verdict twice. The forgotten children watched Eurydice fade into nothingness, and they understood something that they had not expected to learn. The test had not been primarily about Orpheus's faith in divine promises or his trust in his wife's presence. The true test had been about acceptance, the willingness to possess love without needing to control it, to trust without demanding proof, to hope without requiring certainty. Orpheus had achieved the impossible through the perfection of his love and art. He had moved the unmovable, changed the unchangeable, convinced death itself to release its hold on one who had passed beyond the boundary of life. Yet in the moment of his greatest triumph, his very humanity, his need for confirmation, his inability to fully trust in what could not be seen, had transformed success into failure, redemption into loss. The tragedy was not that Orpheus had been deceived or that the gods had been cruel. The tragedy was that the same love that had enabled him to achieve the impossible had also made it impossible for him to fully accept the terms under which the impossible was offered. Orpheus emerged into the sunlight alone, his triumph transformed into the most complete defeat imaginable. He had succeeded beyond all hope, had achieved what no other mortal could even dream of attempting. Yet in the moment of victory, his own human limitations had turned success into failure, joy into anguish, reunion into eternal separation. The forgotten children followed him into the light of day, themselves changed by what they had witnessed. They had thought they understood the nature of their cosmic roles, had believed that their functions were fixed and eternal. But in observing Orpheus's attempt to challenge the fundamental laws of existence, they had discovered capacities within themselves that they had not known they possessed. They had experienced hope and fear, joy and sorrow, the desire for outcomes they could not control. They had learned that even abstract concepts made flesh could be moved by the power of perfect love expressed through perfect art. They had witnessed the birth of new possibilities in a cosmos they had thought was bound by unchangeable laws. In the years that followed Orpheus's return to the world of the living, the forgotten children never left his side. They watched as he wandered the world like a ghost, his lyre silent, his voice stilled by grief too profound for expression. The man who had once made stones weep with the beauty of his music now could not bring himself to create even the simplest melody. He became a figure of legend even as he lived, the greatest musician who ever existed, the mortal who had loved so deeply that he had challenged death itself and almost won. Poets sang of his achievement even as they mourned his loss. Lovers invoked his name as proof that true love could survive any separation, even as they wept for the tragedy of his failure. The forgotten children understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of immortality, not the literal immortality of the gods, but the immortality of story, of meaning, of lessons that would be passed down through generations of mortals who would find in Orpheus's tale a mirror for their own experiences of love and loss. Moros perceived that Orpheus's doom had been transformed by his attempt to challenge it. Where most mortals faced endings that were simply endings, Orpheus had created an ending that was also a beginning, the beginning of a story that would outlast empires, the beginning of a hope that would survive even the destruction of civilizations. Kerr saw that the violent death that eventually claimed Orpheus, torn apart by the frenzied followers of Dionysus who were enraged by his continued devotion to his lost wife, was itself transformed by the context of his story. He died not as a victim but as a martyr to love, and even his dismemberment became part of the legend that would make him immortal. Apate recognized that the greatest truth had emerged from what appeared to be the ultimate deception. Orpheus had been promised reunion and had received separation, had been offered hope and had experienced despair. Yet from this apparent betrayal had come a deeper truth about the nature of love, that its power lay not in its ability to possess but in its willingness to sacrifice, not in its success but in its attempt. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice became more than a tale of individual triumph and failure. It became a fundamental myth about the relationship between love and death, hope and despair, art and truth. The forgotten children carried this story with them as they continued their eternal journey through the cosmos, understanding that they had witnessed something that would reshape how both gods and mortals understood the nature of existence itself. As the classical age waned and new philosophies began to question the old certainties, mortals began to forget the names of the forgotten children entirely. They spoke instead of abstract concepts, fate, death, discord, justice, without remembering that these concepts had once walked the earth in divine form. The children of night became mere ideas, philosophical categories rather than living presences. Yet they endured, as they had always endured, patient and eternal. They understood what mortals often forgot, that ideas, once given form and story, become more than the sum of their definitions. They become forces that shape reality itself, powers that work through every heart and mind that acknowledges their existence. The forgotten children had learned from Orpheus that their own nature was not as fixed as they had believed. They had discovered that even cosmic principles could be moved by sufficient love, that even abstract concepts could learn and grow and change. They had found that witnessing perfect love could awaken in them capacities they had not known they possessed. And so they continue to walk among mortals, these forgotten children of primordial night. When a lover defies convention to save their beloved, when an artist creates beauty that transcends mortality, when someone chooses hope in the face of despair, the forgotten children are there, recognizing in these acts echoes of the great story they witnessed in the underworld. They are present when mortals stand at crossroads between one possibility and another, when choices must be made that will define the meaning of existence. They witness every attempt to challenge fate, every effort to transform ending into beginning, every moment when love demands more than logic can provide. The forgotten children learned from Orpheus that their role in the cosmic order was not simply to enforce unchangeable laws, but to witness the ongoing tension between necessity and possibility, between what must be and what might be. They became guardians not just of fate, but of the eternal hope that fate might sometimes be transcended through the application of perfect love. In every story of love that conquers death, in every tale of art that transforms reality, in every moment when the impossible becomes possible through the power of human devotion, the forgotten children recognize the continuing influence of the music that Orpheus played in the halls of death. They understand that his failure was also a kind of success, his ending a kind of beginning. They carry within themselves now not just the memory of what they witnessed, but the transformation it wrought in their own nature. They remain the embodiments of abstract principles, but they are abstract principles that have learned to hope, to mourn, to celebrate the mysterious power of mortal love to reshape even the foundations of cosmic law. The night that bore them has no end, and neither do they. They will be walking among mortals when the last star burns out and the final story has been told. For they are not merely characters in the great drama of existence. They are the stage upon which all other dramas unfold, the unchanging foundation upon which all change is built. Yet they are also more than that now. They are witnesses to the possibility that even the unchanging might change, that even the eternal might be touched by time, that even the abstract might learn what it means to love. In that possibility, in that eternal hope, they have found a new purpose that transcends their original nature while fulfilling it more completely than they had ever imagined possible. The forgotten children of night walk on, carrying within themselves all the stories that have ever been told and all the stories yet to come. They are memory and possibility, ending and beginning, the eternal shadows that give meaning to all light, the eternal silence that gives significance to all song. Their story has no end because they have learned that endings are not conclusions but transformations, not failures but completions that make new beginnings possible. And in that understanding, born from witnessing the perfect love of Orpheus for Eurydice, they have discovered the deepest truth of all, that even immortality can learn to grow, even eternity can be touched by change, even the most abstract principles can be moved by the simple, terrible, magnificent power of a mortal heart that refuses to accept that love can be defeated by death. Thank you for listening. I wish you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Don't forget to subscribe for more bedtime stories.